You've definitely seen it before, right? The Rorschach Inkblot Test. It's a total icon in psychology, popping up in movies all the time. But, if you strip away all that Hollywood mystique, what is this thing really? What's it actually designed to tell us? Well, that's what we're going to dig into. So the whole test is built around these strange symmetrical ink blots. They were first introduced way back in 1921 by a psychiatrist named Hermann Rorschach. And his idea, it was so simple but kind of profound. He wondered, what happens when you show someone an image that doesn't actually mean anything? What kind of story does their mind come up with to make sense of it?
So what is it really? Is it some sort of magical mind-reading trick, or is it a serious, systematic tool for diagnosis? Well, the truth is, it's a lot more complicated than that. So let's break it down. We're going to look at what the Rorschach actually is, how it's supposed to be used, and what, 100 years of science thinks about its strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so here's our plan. We'll start with the big idea behind it all, the projective hypothesis. Then we'll check out the actual materials, the cards themselves. After that, we'll walk through how the test is given, how the answers are decoded, and wrap up with the big scientific verdict on it. All right, first up, a projective hypothesis. So what are we really looking for here? Before we can even get to the ink blots, we have to get our heads around the psychological theory they're built on. See, the Rorschach isn't just a standalone thing. It's part of a whole category of psychological tools. The Rorschach is what psychologists call a projective test. Now, think about a typical quiz, multiple choice with right and wrong answers. This is the complete opposite. A projective test uses ambiguity, things that are unclear as its main tool. The whole point isn't to see what you know, but to give your mind a blank canvas to project onto. And this gets us to the core idea, the projective hypothesis. The theory goes like this. When you look at something totally unstructured, something with no real meaning, like an ink blot, well, you're forced to create your own structure for it. The meaning you see has to come from somewhere, right? It has to come from inside you. So you end up projecting your own personality, your needs, your conflicts, your way of thinking, right onto that image.
Okay, so what exactly are these ambiguous things we're talking about? Let's get into the materials, the actual tools of the trade. So the official test uses a standard set of just 10 cards, 10 symmetrical ink blots. And a really key detail here is that they're always shown in the exact same order. That's all about keeping things consistent from one person to the next. All right, so 5 of those 10 cards are what we call achromatic. That's just a fancy way of saying they're in black and white. So black ink, white paper, and all the shades of gray in between. The thinking is that these cards can give clues about how someone deals with situations that are, more straightforward without a lot of emotional color. Then you've got 2 cards that are mostly black and white, but, and this is a big but, they have these really noticeable splashes of red. Just adding that one powerful color is totally intentional. It's meant to see how a person reacts when something a bit jarring or emotionally charged is thrown into the mix. And finally, the last 3 cards are fully chromatic, meaning they're in full color, with a bunch of different pastel shades. These are supposed to give insight into how someone handles more complex emotional stuff. And you can probably tell, this mix of black and white, red, and full color isn't random at all. It's a huge part of how the answers are eventually interpreted. Okay, so we have the cards, but giving the test isn't as simple as just showing them to someone. It's actually a really structured conversation with 2 distinct phases. Yeah, the whole process is split into 2 key parts. First, there's the free association phase, and then there's the inquiry phase. And they both have very, very different jobs. So here's how that works. In phase 1, the free association part, the psychologist shows you a card and asks something really simple, like, what might this be? And then they just listen. They write down everything you say, word for word, no interruptions. Then, once you've gone through all the cards, phase 2, the inquiry, begins. Now they go back to every single thing you said and ask for details. Okay, you said you saw a bat. Where exactly did you see that? And what was it about the blot that made it look like a bat to you? All right, this leads us to what might be the trickiest part of the whole thing, decoding the responses. And here's the absolute key takeaway. It's not so much about what you see, but how you see it. Now, to make sure this isn't just one person's subjective opinion, psychologists have developed these really complex scoring systems. I mean, you have to. The most famous and widely used one is called Exner's comprehensive system. It's basically a rule book, a standardized way to code and analyze all the information you gathered. So let's look at how that system breaks things down. It really comes down to three big categories. First, you've got location. This is all about where you saw the thing. Did you use the whole ink blot, just one big piece of it? Or maybe you even saw something in the white space around the ink. Then there's determinants. This asks what made you see it. Was it the shape, the color? Did it seem like it was moving? Was it the shading that made it look like a texture? And finally, you have content, which is the simplest one. What did you see? A person, an animal, a landscape, whatever. Okay, that all sounds incredibly detailed, right? But it brings us to the million-dollar question, the one that's been debated for decades. Does any of this actually work?
Yeah, the whole debate really boils down to two words: reliability and validity. Reliability just means, is it consistent? If two people score the same test, will they get the same result? And validity means, does it actually measure what it says it's measuring? And believe me, how the Rorschach stacks up on these two things, that's where all the controversy is.
So let's look at both sides of the aisle here. On the pro side, people say that when you use a standardized system like Exner's, it's actually pretty reliable. Two different experts will probably score it the same way, and they'll argue it can be super useful for spotting things like thought disorders. But then you have the other side. The critics raise huge questions about its validity. They'll say, sure, it's consistent, but is it measuring anything real? A lot of studies suggest it's not as valid as other big personality tests, and they often point to flaws in the research that supports it.
So where does that leave us? Well, because this debate is still very much alive, a lot of clinicians today have kind of shifted how they think about the Rorschach. They don't really see it as a test in the traditional sense, with a clear score. Instead, they see it more as a complex way to gather information. Think of it like a structured conversation that just happens to use ink blots to see how a person puts their world together and approaches problems. So in the end, the Rorschach is still one of the most fascinating and most divisive tools in all of psychology. Is it this one-of-a-kind window into the human psyche, or is it just a really beautiful but ultimately flawed idea from the past? The debate is far from over, and maybe the answer, well, maybe it's a bit like the ink blots themselves. It all depends on how you choose to see it.